Thank you. Gentleman's time expired. I have to ask the witnesses a question. A little complicated scheduling thing going on here. We are scheduled to have votes at 1:30-ish. My plan would be to, if we could go to that period, get through that, take the break then. But it's been a while. If you need a break earlier, we can take a 15-minute break at 12:30. And I wish there was an easier way to do this, but totally up to you. Would you like to break at 12:30, or would you like to just go until votes?
I think we're good for right now, Chairman. And
Okay. If you need a break, just, you know.
We'll fire the star cluster.
We all have we all have overprotective aides who are like, you know, pounding on us that they need a break, So I just figured I'd ask. So we will proceed, and I appreciate that. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. General McKenzie, the Washington Post reported on August 28th that the Taliban offered to allow the U.S. military to take responsibility for security in Kabul. Did you meet with Mullah Baradar to discuss such an offer?
I met with Mullah Baradar in Doha on 15 August to pass a message to him that we were withdrawing, and if they attempted to disrupt that withdrawal, we would punish them severely for that.
But did he offer to allow you to have security over all of Kabul? Not
as part of that conversation, he said, well, why don't you just take security for all of Kabul? That was not why I was there. That was not my instruction, and we did not have the resources to undertake that mission.
Did you convey the offer, however, to the President?
The offer was made in the presence of the President's Special Representative to Afghanistan.
Do you know if the SRAP conveyed it to the President?
I don't know, but it was conveyed to my chain of command.
So who made the decision to turn down the Taliban offer to allow the U.S. military to secure Kabul and put the safety of our troops in the hands of the Taliban?
I did not consider that to be a formal offer, and it was not the reason why I was there, so I did not pursue it. So if someone actually made a decision, that would have been me.
So we don't know if it was conveyed to the President. We don't know.
I do know it was conveyed to my chain of command.
Okay. What do you, in military terms, what do you call the retreat of military forces under security provided by and with the permission of enemy forces?
Don't know. I've never done one of those operations.
I think you just did one of those operations.
I disagree.
You disagree. So you
Yes.
did not withdraw forces from Afghanistan after a negotiation with the Taliban?
That is correct. We did not do that.
Okay. So this would not be a conditional surrender, in your opinion?
This would not be a conditional
So
surrender.
what would you describe the operation?
I would describe it as a non-combatant evacuation operation that we conducted with our own timing and with our own forces, and we warned the Taliban that if they interfered with that operation, we would strike them hard. They chose not to interfere with that operation.
Okay, so you're saying the meeting you had in Doha was just to let the Taliban know this is what we're doing, you know, take it or leave it, but you were operating at that point under the agreement we had negotiated with the Taliban for surrender, right? The Doha agreement.
I was there to tell the Taliban that we were conducting a non-combatant evacuation operation.
But wait. A NEO, by DOD definition, does not definitionally include the evacuation of combatants. You were also evacuating combatants, so the NEO was part of the operation.
Actually, no, you're wrong. When I met with the Taliban on 15 August, we had completed the withdrawal operation. Further forces that went in were forces that were core to the NEO operation. And in fact, DOD doctrine would include the insertion and extraction of combatant forces as part of a NEO operation.
But what do we call the withdrawal of combatants, whether it happened before?
It can be called a retrograde. It could be called a withdrawal.
Retrograde. Was it in your orders, though? What were you tasked with doing?
I was tasked to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation.
Which you just said happened after you had withdrawn forces.
Largely, that's correct.
Okay. And you didn't get tasking. What did the tasking to withdraw the forces call that operation?
I would have to go back and take a look at it. I believe it was a withdrawal.
Withdrawal. Okay. Which I believe the definition is a repositioning of forces. I would call it a conditional surrender. I guess we'll have to check the dictionary definition on that. Just to go to something that General Milley said before, has Al-Qaeda sworn bayat to the Taliban?
I believe there's a deep relationship between the Taliban.
But have they sworn bayat? Just yes or no?
I couldn't answer that question for you right now.
Oh, I believe General Milley said it before. Has the Taliban renounced the previous oath that Al-Qaeda swore?
The Taliban and Al-Qaeda have a very close relationship, and I do not expect the Taliban to seriously interfere with their basing and repositioning in Afghanistan, which is, I think, the question you're asking.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me get it a different way. The new interior minister for the Taliban government is Siraj Haqqani. He's a known Al-Qaeda associate. Is there any evidence that he or the Haqqani network has broken with Al-Qaeda?
None.
Did the March attack on Fob Chapman breach the Doha agreement, in your opinion?
No, it did not.
It did not. General McKenzie, do you know which Taliban forces were actually providing security in front of the airport?
Yes, we do.
Was it Badri 313?
They were part of it. There were other elements as well. It was a hodgepodge of units.
But
As you
Badri
know,
313 was part
among
of it.
others.
Among others. A group
Among
that
many others.
specializes in suicide bombing attacks. Had the suicide bomber been imprisoned, I think you suggested to Congresswoman Hartzler that the suicide bomber might have been imprisoned in Bagram before. Do we know?
I don't recall suggesting that.
Okay. Oh, so do we know whether he had been?
We are still working very hard to find out where the suicide bomber came from.
Did we have an opportunity to take him out prior to the suicide bombing attack?
We did not.
We did not have an opportunity to take him out. And just finally, does the over-horizon posture that we're now adopting, will that be more or less difficult now that we are out of the country?
I've said on the record it will be very difficult to do. It is not impossible to do.
Okay, thank
Gentleman's
you.
time has expired. Mr. Kim is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General McKenzie, I wanted to start with you. You said reports about you engaging with the Taliban about a red line around Kabul before its fall were false. Does that mean that there was no discussion or consideration in the U.S. of a plan to defend Kabul in early August before its fall?
There was never a discussion about a plan to defend Kabul before its fall. I will say that when I went to Doha, I took with me a graphic. It was a map of Kabul with a 30-kilometer ring on the outside. Our original proposal was we would ask the Taliban to stay outside that ring, but we were not going to threaten them. We felt that was the best way to do deconfliction. However, on the day of the meeting, they were already in downtown Kabul, so the graphic was outdated, and we had to proceed from the new reality.
Secretary Austin, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. When I spent some time in the Situation room with you in 2014, when we were fearing the fall of Erbil and Baghdad, U.S. CENTCOM commander immediately drew up some con-ops on defending those positions using air assets. The effort was to buy time for the Iraqis and the Iraqi Kurds to reconstitute. Did it not cross your mind to consider something like that in early August before the fall of Kabul?
This is certainly something we considered. You know, we took a look at what we would need to do to protect the embassy, and if we had to do a NEO, what could we do to buy time for that operation to take place?
Chairman Milley, I wanted to switch to you. Yesterday, you said that you were asked on August 25th to make a decision about the August 31st deadline. Was there an actual formal request made to the Taliban by the United States to stay past August 31st? Was there a request that was then denied that you were taking into account in that decision?
I don't make decisions, Congressman. I provide advice.
In your recommendation.
So I was asked for what's called best military advice. I'm not aware of a formal request to the Taliban one way or the other on staying past the 31st. I am very familiar with the advice that we provided on the 25th.
Before the fall of Kabul, did we actually have formal Taliban agreement upon an August 31st departure date?
I'm not sure what you mean by formal, but I think that's a
Had there
policy.
ever been a point where the United States went to the Taliban saying that we are planning to leave on August 31st?
Sure.
And I'm talking about prior to the fall of Kabul.
Yeah, I think from a policy perspective, Zal Khalilzad could give you the detailed information on that. I do believe the Taliban knew that we were departing on the 31st. We announced it.
But you weren't aware of it?
I'm not aware of
so that I
a
should
formal
ask.
agreement per se, but I think Zal Khalilzad could give you better definition of that.
General McKenzie, I want
Yes,
to turn back to you then, because you were saying that you talked with the Taliban on August 15th. Did you use August 31st as a date to end the operations? Was there a date set at all in your discussions with them?
I did not use a specific date when I talked to them.
So no date was set on August 15th on
I
when
did not
the U.S. would
convey, I did
depart?
not convey a specific date as part of my conversation.
I wanted to switch gears one more time here. Secretary Austin, moving forward, when we're looking at the fundamental viability of the over-the-horizon effort, is the airspace over Afghanistan currently considered sovereign airspace? And I guess I'll frame it in a slightly different way. Is it currently legal for the United States to conduct ISR sorties and airstrikes in Afghanistan?
Yes.
Under what authority is that legal?
Well, same authorities we were using before.
And that would be under the Security and Defense Cooperation Agreement of 2014, is that correct?
No, I think what we're prosecuting now is are the authorities that were referred to by General McKenzie earlier, and he mentioned he would have to take that into a classified setting.
Okay, well, I'll certainly follow with you that way. General McKenzie, something I wanted to follow up with you on. Yesterday in your hearing in front of the Senate, you made a comment when asked about the war on terror, and you said that the war on terror is not over, but then you also went on and said that the war in Afghanistan is not over. So I just wanted a clarification from you. In your opinion, is the war in Afghanistan over?
So I believe the war in Afghanistan is not over. I believe we are no longer a party to that war, but that doesn't mean that ISIS and the Taliban aren't going to engage in a furious fight this fall that may result in the ISIS being crushed, or it may result in
Oh, I
ISIS
see. So
holding
when
ground.
you're saying that, you're referring that you believe that, you know, there's a civil war in Afghanistan, but in terms of the United States war against Afghanistan, you would say that that is over.
We have no forces in Afghanistan. Our only interest in Afghanistan is looking for ISIS-K and
Gentleman's time
al-Qaeda targets.
has expired.
Thank you,
Mr.
Chairman.
Gates is recognized.
February 26, 2020, House Armed Services Committee, General Mark Milley. We know we're not going to defeat the Taliban militarily, and they're not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily. You really blew that call, didn't you, General?
I believe that that was a issue of strategic stalemate, and that if we had remained in Afghanistan with the advisory levels of effort, then the government of Afghanistan.
Well, that's an interesting
Afghan
answer to a
security
question. It's
forces-
just not one I asked. You spent more time with Bob Woodward on this book than you spent analyzing the very likely prospect that the Afghanistan government was going to fall immediately to the Taliban, didn't you?
Not even close, Congressman.
Oh, really? Because you said right after Kabul fell that no one could have anticipated the immediate fall of the Ghani government. When did you become aware that Joe Biden tried to get Ghani to lie about the conditions in Afghanistan? He did that in July. Did you know that right away?
I'm not aware of what President Biden.
You're not aware of
Lying
the
or-
phone call that Biden had with Ghani where he said, whether it is true or not, we want you to go out there and paint a rosy picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. You're the chief military advisor to the president. You said that the Taliban was not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily, which, by the way, they cut through them like a hot knife through butter. And then the president tries to get Ghani to lie. When did you become aware of that attempt?
Well, there's two things there, Congressman, if I may. One is what I said was the situation was stalemate, and if we kept advisors with there, the government of Afghanistan and the Army would have still been there. That's what I said. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But
Seems wrong now with
Well,
the Taliban in
we
control.
withdrew
I
all
have a
the-
question
we
for
withdrew all the
Secretary
advice.
Austin. Secretary Austin, are you capable of assessing whether another has the will to fight?
No, we're not, and that's the point that the chairman made earlier. So.
That's just like an incredibly disappointing thing for the Secretary of Defense to simply say, I can't assess whether someone has the will to fight. But it is consistent with your record. I mean, during the Obama administration, I think they gave you about $48 million to go train up some folks in Syria to go take on the Assad government. And I think your testimony was that only 4 or 5 survived first contact with the enemy. So what confidence should this committee have in you, or should the country have in you, when you've now confessed to us, and whether it's the swing and a miss in Afghanistan that General Milley talked to the Senate about yesterday, total failure, or whether it was your failures in Syria, you don't seem capable to look at a fighting force and determine whether or not they have the will.
Well,
Is that an
you
embarrassing?
recall, Congressman, that the end result was the SDF that we stood up that was very, very instrumental in turning the tide of battle up in Syria.
Oh, yeah, turned it so much. You've got Assad in power in Syria. You've got the Taliban in power in Afghanistan. I mean, where have you been?
The focus was ISIS, Congressman, and those forces had significant effect on the ISIS network.
It just seems like you're chronically bad at this, and you have admitted that, I guess, which is to your credit. But you know, when people in the military, like Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller, stand up and demand accountability, when they say that you all screwed up, when they point out that General Milley's statement that that the government of Afghanistan is not going to get defeated by the Taliban, well, he ends up in the brig. And you all end up in front of us, and your former employer, Raytheon, ends up with a lot of money, and we have poured cash and blood and credibility into a Ghani government that was a mirage. It fell immediately. And while the guy sitting next to you was off, talking to Phil Rucker and was off doing his thing with Bob Woodward, we were buying into the big lie. The big lie that this was ever going to be successful and that we could ever rely on the Afghanistan government for anything at all. You know, General Milley, you kind of gave up the game earlier when you said you wanted to address elements of your personal conduct that were in question. We're not questioning your personal conduct. We're questioning in your official capacity going and undermining the chain of command, which is obviously what you did. You've created this whole chain of communication narrative.
Did not undermine the chain of command in
yeah,
any manner,
you did.
shape, or form.
You absolutely did. And it
Did not.
Well, you know what? You said yesterday that you weren't going to resign when senators asked you this question. And I believe that you guys probably won't resign. You seem to be very happy failing up over there. But if we didn't have a president that was so addled, you all would be fired, because that is what you deserve. You have let down the people who wear the uniform in my district and all around this country, and you're far more interested in what your perception is and how people think about you in insider Washington books than you care about winning,
Gentleman's
which this
time
group
has
seems incapable
expired.
of doing.
Ms. Houlihan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, I apologize for the behavior of my colleague. I'm deeply, deeply appreciative of your service and of the decades of experience that you all bring to this conversation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask important questions of you, questions that ought to be asked of you in the spirit of our responsibility of oversight rather than provocation. So I just have a couple of questions of clarification from this testimony that's happened so far, and the first one is for you, General McKenzie. You mentioned something about, in your opening remarks, about you having looked at different branches to account for the complete collapse of the government and the Afghan military. That's the first time, frankly, that I've heard that scenario being articulated out loud. Most of the testimony that I've heard prior to this has been we could have never foreseen that. So as somebody who's a decision, a branching engineer type person, that's what I do. I'm intrigued to see if that is indeed what you did have and what the likelihood you put to that and the cost that you associated with that would be. So
as we drew up the NEO plan, one of the assumptions of the NEO plan was that the Afghan military would be able to continue to secure H-Kaya, the airfield, because the Turks were there, but they only actually secured a small fraction of the airfield, maybe 20% of it. The rest of that long perimeter around the entire runway was actually secured by Afghan military forces. So our assumption was they would continue to perform that function. But since we stated that as an assumption, by the way we plan, we have to say if that assumption's wrong, because an assumption is a future hypothetical condition that we believe is going to occur. We felt that was always something that we should challenge. So we developed a plan if that assumption failed, if they melted away. So we had a branch plan that was developed as part of the overall NEO plan, where we would introduce adequate combat forces to physically take over securing the perimeter of that airfield in case the ANDSF did melt away. Well, as we got into the first week of August, it began to look increasingly likely that they would melt away. So I talked to the Secretary, talked to the Chairman, and we agreed to begin to flow forces in for that contingency.
Thank you. And my question to you, related for all three of you, and perhaps we'd start with you, General, is how long have you believed that the Afghan military might not be up to the task of taking over and maintaining security against the Taliban? We discussed a lot of different timelines over the course of the last few months. Has it been inevitable for 5 or 10 years? How long have you been relaying that information or that concern possibly to any of our senior leaders or senior administration, if you could share that with us as well?
Ma'am, so I'll start. I think it actually, from the relatively short-term perspective, I think the Doha Agreement and the signing of the Doha Agreement had a really pernicious effect on the government of Afghanistan and on its military. Psychological more than anything else, but we set a date certain for when we were going to leave and when they could expect all assistance to end. So for the first time, there was something out there in front of them. Now, I think that's an important thing. The other point would be, it's been my position and my judgment that if we went below an advisory level of 2,500, I believe that the government of Afghanistan would likely collapse and that the military would follow. And one might go before the other, but I believe that was going to be the inevitable result of drawing down to zero, and I've expressed that opinion in writing for quite a while. Now, so taking a look at that, that was sort of my best judgment on that. I believe that So going below 2,500, I think, was the other sort of nail in the coffin, if you will, that allowed the Afghan government, that led to conditions where, first of all, we could no longer see what was happening to the force because our advisors were no longer down there with those units. So let me give you an example. If we shipped a box of mortar rounds into Afghanistan, we would sign it over on the ramp at H-Kaya, and the Afghans would truck it away. There would be nobody below that level to help them disperse it, to see if it went to the bazaar or if it went down to the unit that needed mortar rounds.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Secretary Austin, it looked like you had something to contribute as well.
I certainly agree with comments that General McKenzie has made. I would just add to that as a part of that agreement, we agreed to cease conducting air operations against the Taliban. So the Taliban got stronger. They increased their offensive operations against the Afghan security forces. And the Afghans were losing a lot of people on a weekly basis. In addition to that, we caused them to release 5,000 prisoners, and those prisoners, many of those prisoners went back to fill the ranks of the Taliban. So they got a lot stronger. They continued their attacks. We got smaller. And so I agree with General McKenzie. That's when you could begin to see things really begin to head in a different direction.
So with the last 4 seconds, I very much appreciate your time, and very intriguing that it seems like the Doha agreement might have been a pivotal point. And thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, you said today that you saw this as a strategic failure. As a 30-year veteran and someone who's been deployed 4 times myself, and I haven't served as long as the three of you, but it breaks our heart. And I think most veterans feel heartbroken knowing that the blood and the treasure spilt ended up in a strategic failure. I think we're enraged by it. Then to have the president come out and say that this was a success and he had no regrets, that does not break our heart. That makes us mad as hell that he would say it that way. So I want to say that up front. Secondly, the fact that President Biden on ABC said that no one that he can recall advised him to keep a force of about 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. It's not true. We heard yesterday, we've heard today, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the CENTCOM commander advised differently. I have no other view to see this as a lie, a falsehood from our president. That makes us mad as hell too. Thirdly, I think it's important to point out that this committee, for well over a year, cautioned both presidents against a premature withdrawal from Afghanistan. In fact, Republican and Democratic members of both the House and Senate were so concerned at the risk of a calendar-based withdrawal that we passed a law to prevent it. In fact, the chairman of this committee voted for it when it restricted President Trump. Section 1215 of the 2021 NDA prohibited any president, regardless of political party, from drawing down below 2,500 troops until the Secretary of Defense, in consultation with the Secretary of State and the DNI, provided Congress a detailed plan explaining how the U.S. would continue to conduct counterterror operations in Afghanistan following U.S. withdrawal. How would the U.S. conduct an orderly transition of security functions to the Afghan military? And how would the U.S. protect Americans who remained in country? And how would the U.S. coordinate any such withdrawal with our NATO allies? In short, every single failure that we are now witnessing, Congress warned against in writing in a law over a year ago. But after taking office, President Biden, I'm referring to, we wrote to the Biden administration reminding them that it was not permitted to go below 2,500 until it provided assurances to Congress that our vital interests could be secured. Despite clear congressional intent, backed by statute, this did not happen. The day after taking office, the newly confirmed Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Powell, wrote to the members of this committee essentially stating that President Biden was smarter than Congress, was confident he had all the angles covered, and believed it was not in the national interest to provide Congress with the assurances required in Section 1215. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay, my first question here, General McKenzie, I think one of the reasons that the Afghan forces crumbled much quicker than we ever assessed was that we pulled most of our air cover, we took the mechanics away from the Afghan forces, and we pulled out a lot of our logistics capabilities. Do you see this as underlying reasons why the Afghan forces collapsed?
I think all of those reasons contributed to why they collapsed.
Should it even surprised us when we take away most of our air power that they were used to having, that they would just pull the rug out from underneath them, General?
Well, my position all along has been if you go to zero, if you go to a state where you're not going to be able to maintain their forces on the ground, that a collapse is inevitable. I have to further say I did not see it coming as fast as it did. I thought it would be a matter of into the fall or into the winter. I did not see it happen in 11 days in August.
Thank you. General Milley, I appreciate your candor about this being a strategic failure. How does this embolden al-Qaeda, ISIS, and what does it do to Russia, China, and Iran, seeing how we responded in this retreat?
I think the Taliban sitting in Kabul significantly emboldens the radical jihadi movement globally. The analogy I've used with many others is it likely will put a shot of adrenaline into their arm. Their grandfathers defeated the Soviet Union in the war in Afghanistan many, many years ago, and they are taking this on their own networks right now and declaring it a major victory. So I think it's a big morale boost. I think it remains to be seen. I think the Russians are quite scared, not scared, I guess concerned, of terrorists coming across the borders into their near abroad. China is very complicated. They've got a significant issue in their western hemisphere, or in their western part of their country. I think Iran now has to deal with a very complicated issue on their border that may or may not be friendly.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, General Milley. I yield.
And I do want to make a comment, because I actually watched the George Stephanopoulos interview before this hearing with Joe. Joe Biden did not say that no one suggested that we should keep 2,500 troops there.
I read the quote.
I have the time.
It was my
at the
quote.
moment. I have the time.
Well,
and what he said was, you cannot have 2,500 troops stay there in a stable situation. So we should at least be accurate about what information was provided. I would urge everyone to go back and actually look at the words and not take what is being said here as accurate.
Chairman, I read the quote.
I read it too, and I read it with a clear, open vision of what he was saying, not with a bent to try and make sure that we could successfully have a partisan attack on him. He was asked, could they stay there in a stable environment? That is the option he said wasn't on the table, not because it wasn't offered, but because it didn't exist. And while we're ripping apart these three gentlemen here, I want to remind everybody that the decision the president made was to stop fighting a war that after 20 years it was proven we could not win. There was no easy way to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that General Bacon was clear.
If he had just
to be defended.
I will be happy to yield Mr. Rogers' time when I am done. What he made clear was we needed to stop fighting a war that for 20 years we've had these conversations over and over again. Democrats bash on the Republican president more than they bash on the Democratic presidents. Republicans bash on the Democratic presidents more than they bash on the Republican presidents. But the end result was the same. 20 years of an endless series of decisions by very intelligent, very capable, very committed people. Any implication that the three gentlemen in front of us are not very capable, very intelligent, and very committed to this country is simply partisan political opportunism. We can look at 20 years. Pick your favorite general, pick your favorite president, pick your favorite leader, okay? None of them could successfully do what so many members of this committee are sitting here telling these gentlemen that they're basically idiots for not being able to do. We should pause for just a moment and think about the fact that maybe that's the wrong argument. Maybe the mission itself was really hard to achieve. And what President Biden said is, we're done. We're not going to have these hearings anymore. We're not going to have the funerals anymore. We're not going to lose the service members fighting a war that it is clear we cannot be successful. And we all pick nits on this decision or that decision. Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you do that? 20 years of a whole lot of different people leading has led us to this point. And we said we're going to stop.
Mr. Chairman, this is inconceivable. They're bringing the war here. The war is not over. It's coming to America. The funerals are here, Mr. Chairman, and we count on you and your leadership and these generals to know the war is not over.
It is clear that you have to interrupt.
Mr. Chairman, we're not done with this war. The point is, yes, we are going to have to continue to contain this threat.
And 20 years
no
of
question
mistakes
about
aren't
it.
an excuse
Having
for the
US
failure of
troops
the
in
withdrawal.
Afghanistan was not succeeding.
Mr. Chairman, point
I
of
have
order.
to make that point. Mr. Rogers is the ranking member on the committee, and I will give him the time to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did note the Stephanopoulos interview, and I disagree with your interpretation. Mr. Stephanopoulos came back and asked him again. So you're saying that nobody advised you to leave the troops, and that was his response. But I think the general officers here and the Secretary have made it very clear that they gave the President advice that he wouldn't.
We're done. We're not going to have these hearings anymore. We're not going to have the funerals anymore. We're not going to lose the service members fighting a war that it is clear we cannot be successful. And we all pick nits on this decision or that decision. Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you do that? 20 years of a whole lot of different people leading has led us to this point. And we said we're going to stop.
Mr. Chairman, this is inconceivable. They're bringing the war here. The war is not over. It's coming to America. The funerals are here, Mr. Chairman, and we count on you and your leadership and these generals to know the war is not over.
It is clear that you have to interrupt.
Mr. Chairman, we're not done with this war.
The point is, yes, we are going to have to continue to contain this threat.
And 20 years
no
of mistakes aren't an excuse for the failure of the withdrawal.
Afghanistan was not succeeding.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
I have to make that point. Mr. Rogers is the ranking member on the committee, and I will give him the time to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did note the Stephanopoulos interview, and I disagree with your interpretation. Mr. Stephanopoulos came back and asked him again. So you're saying that nobody advised you to leave the troops, and that was his response. But I think the general officers here and the Secretary have made it very clear that they gave the President advice that he wouldn't listen to. The last president, they gave him advice, and he did listen to it. So, I mean, I'm not challenging, and I have not in any way disparaged these great gentlemen. In fact, in my opening remarks, I made it abundantly clear I don't want them shouldering blame for what happened in this withdrawal when it was the administration and the State Department and National Security Advisor. And with that, I'll yield a minute to Mr. Bacon.
Mr. Crow is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dovetailing on Chairman Smith's comment, I just can't help but think back to my last deployment in Afghanistan in 2005. And there was a moment where I had been awake for several days, walking with a heavy rucksack in the mountains of Afghanistan, and wondering and asking myself, where was the debate? Why weren't people asking the questions then? Why weren't people paying attention? And I'm glad they are now, and I'm glad we are having this debate. But as Chairman Smith adequately pointed out, we could have been doing this a long time ago. 4 administrations, Republican and Democrat, 10 Congresses, Republican and Democrat. This is a 20-year conflict that our country owns, and we have to have a broader discussion. It's not a 2-month conflict. And I appreciate your candor, and I appreciate the seriousness with which all 3 of you have dealt with this. So with that in mind, the fact that there are serious issues that have to be addressed, I have 2 lines of questioning. One about our continuing obligation to our partners, and the next about the planning in advance of the evacuation. Now, I want to start the partner question with a recognition that I believe firmly that all 3 of you share as deeply as I do a sense that we have a continuing obligation, because all 3 of you served, and I know that all 3 of you have friends who are still there. They have names and faces. So I'm not going to question your commitment to this. The department has a very narrow but important role going forward here. And that role is to provide employment verification to folks so they can be properly vetted and evacuated. That's very hard to do without boots on the ground now. So what can the department do more going forward, and what is the plan to do that employment verification, to get that paperwork in the hands of our friends so we can get them evacuated?
One of my undersecretaries is leading an effort to ensure that that we can help improve the process of employment verification. If you think back 20 years, ago, when people were actually helping us, helping contractors that were working for us, some of the documentation very, very difficult to get your hands on now. So we're working to see what we can do to improve this. We want to work with Congress to if there's any way that we can adjust requirements or adjust our ability to ease this process along, we certainly want to do that. But we're taking this on in a very serious way. So.
Well, I appreciate that, and we stand ready and willing to continue to work with you to solve this, because certainly our combat operations are over, but we have that continued obligation, as you have often noted. The last is about the evacuation planning. There were 2 tabletop rehearsals, one in June and one in August. The June 11th one dealt with processing of evacuees. These are interagency tabletop exercises that involve the Department of State. The August 6th one, my understanding, dealt with scenarios for both a permissive and a non-permissive NEO. So for the August 6th tabletop, the State Department was involved in that tabletop. Coming out of that tabletop exercise, did the department have, in your opinion, an adequate understanding as to the State Department's plan and role to conduct vetting and processing of evacuees at HKIA?
I believe they did, but I also urged State, I felt that by nature, the Department of Defense can move very fast on issues like this. I felt that we were not completely aligned with State on that. There were still some things they could do faster, and I believe they tried their very best to address those, particularly in terms of providing additional processing power, if you will, to move people through the chain from the consular officers and other people to move them forward. State representatives took that message on board very seriously at the tabletop exercises.
So the lack of complete alignment, in your view, has to do with the processing power that was necessary to push forward on the ground.
There were probably other things. That was, from my perspective, as who was going to be responsible for identifying people, getting them out of Afghanistan and getting them into the pipeline. That's what I was personally most concerned about. There were other issues. That was my principal concern.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Congressman Crow, if I could just 2 other sessions before that, 28 April and 8 May. I think we owe you some answers for the record.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Banks for 5 minutes.
Thank you. General Milley, why is it important for the military to be non-political?
I think an apolitical military is critical to the health of this republic.
General, why did you spend, you've already established yesterday and today, you spent a significant amount of time talking to political book authors and political reporters, including Bob Woodward. What compelled you to do that?
I believe that part of my job is to communicate to the media what we do as a government, what we do as a military, to explain to the people. And so I do interviews regularly with print media, books, documentaries, videos on TV, TV interviews. I think it's part of a senior official's job to be transparent, and I believe in a free press.
What happens when a military general becomes a political figure?
You would
agree that's dangerous?
I think it's dangerous, and I have done my best to remain personally apolitical and to try to keep the military out of actual domestic politics. And I made a point of that from the time I became the chairman, and especially beginning last summer.
You told us, you told the Senate yesterday you hadn't read the book or any of the other political books that have come out, but I don't know how anybody could read the Bob Woodward book. I don't know how you could read it and not be greatly embarrassed about its contents, especially in how it's related to you. Are you embarrassed by the book?
I haven't read the book yet.
Are you embarrassed by the portrayals of the book? No doubt you're aware of them.
Embarrassed, no. I'm concerned that there's mischaracterizations of me becoming very politicized as an individual, and that it's my willingness to become politicized, which is not true. I am trying to stay apolitical, and I believe I am. That's part of my professional ethic, and I'm trying to keep the military, the actual military, out of actual domestic politics. I think that's critical.
Do you regret speaking with Bob Woodward?
No, I think that it's important for me to speak to the media.
I want to talk about some of the contents of the book. Since you haven't read it, maybe I can read some of it to you. We've already heard a little bit about the back and forth with you and Speaker Pelosi. But in that conversation, you said in a phone call with Speaker Pelosi, she said, quote, "Republicans are enablers of President Trump's behavior. You know he's crazy. He's been crazy for a long time." You replied, "I agree with you on everything." That was repeated 3 times in the prologue of the book Peril, that you told Speaker Pelosi that you agree with her on everything. Is that an accurate portrayal of your recounting to Bob Woodward about those conversations?
Not exactly, no. I think that,
So
in fact, I know what I
Bob Woodward wrong? Is that portrayal wrong?
In fact, I know what I said, which was, Madam Speaker, I am not qualified to determine the mental health or assess the mental health of this president or any
Did you tell the
president.
Speaker that you agreed with her on everything?
And what I was referring to when I said that was I agree that we need to have the processes and procedures in place to make sure that we don't have an accidental or illegal or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. And I do agree with that. And we do have those procedures.
You said you agreed with her. According to Bob Woodward,
I'm not agreeing with her.
Bob Woodward is right or you're right.
I am not agreeing with her assessment of the president, nor
The book also goes on in talking about the January 6th riot. It says that you told Bob Woodward that you wrote in a list in your notebook of groups that you personally believe were responsible for the attack and that you associated with it. Quote, and you call these groups, quote, domestic terrorist or this domestic terrorism. That list included in your notebook, according to Bob Woodward and from your conversations with him, Nazis and Oath Keepers, but it also included 2 conservative media outlets that you listed in your notebook, including the Epoch Times, which, by the way, is a news outlet that was founded by critics of the Chinese Communist Party, and Newsmax, which is the second most watched conservative media outlet in the country today. Do your notes about January 6th reference both Epoch Times and Newsmax as on a list of domestic terrorists?
I'm not recalling this conversation at all.
It's in the book.
It may be in the book. I haven't read the book. I'm not recalling a conversation about Newsmax, Epoch Times.
Do you have a notebook that lists Newsmax and Epoch Times as domestic terrorists as recounted by the Bob Woodward book Peril? Or is Bob Woodward lying to us in the book?
I don't know. I don't recall any conversation about Epoch Times.
Do you believe that Newsmax and Epoch Times are domestic terrorists or their
No,
viewers
I think,
or readers
no,
are
I
domestic
think,
terrorists?
not at all. I don't think Epoch Times nor Newsmax are domestic terrorist organizations.
Will you
I
produce
believe they
your
are.
notes to this committee
I'll produce
that
any
you
notes you
relayed to
want.
Bob Woodward in the book that you listed different groups that were responsible for January 6th?
Sure, absolutely.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I will just note for the record that I was quoted in that book as well, and a lot of what I said was conflated and not 100% accurately portrayed. It does happen. Just because someone says something doesn't mean that it is an accurate portrayal and doesn't even mean they're lying. It could be a misunderstanding about what was actually said. Ms. Slotkin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for the work that you've done. I think, obviously, the level of back and forth on the committee today represents some real stress in the system about the withdrawal and what it means, but also about, you know, an interest in politicizing national security issues, which I have real issues with. Can I just ask, I think the question I get asked the most in my district about our withdrawal from Afghanistan is, are we safer now than we were on September 10th, 2001? And I believe, and I've certainly answered many veterans who have reached out, that I believe their work was valuable and worthy. We kept al-Qaeda and other groups distracted and destabilized so that we could build up our national security apparatus, our homeland security here, to make us safer. So it is, of course, hard to hear from this panel that right now we are safer, but we have to watch for the reconstitution of these terrorist groups. No one likes to hear that. I would ask that we get a classified briefing on our over-the-horizon posture, just so we understand. I understand we can't do it in open session, but just so we understand what, on this committee, what we can expect when it comes to watching those threats. So I'd ask for that commitment. But as someone who served in Iraq with the CIA, we watched the reconstitution of al-Qaeda in Western Iraq, which became ISIS. what are the tripwires, I guess Secretary Austin and then General Milley, that you are looking for that would push you to engage the White House and say, hey, we have a real problem here? What are those specific things that you're looking for that would change your assessment from one of, you know, we're all right now, to we need to take more significant military action?
Thanks. First, on your request for an over-the-horizon capability brief, we'll certainly sign up for that. I committed to the chairman to do that early on, and I'll have General McKenzie and the Joint Staff and my policy people in that brief as well.
Thank you.
In terms of specific areas that we're focused on, we're looking at their ability to develop a capability to export terror to the homeland here. Whether or not, you know, if we see senior leaders beginning to have freedom of movement in Afghanistan, if we see them developing capability in training camps and other things, if we see them moving people back and forth across international boundaries, those are things that we're looking for. And again, it will take time to develop this a true intel picture of what's going on. And we've begun that work, and we'll continue. We'll remain focused on this throughout.
General Milley.
The specific indicators and warnings I'd like to take to a different session, but in general, what we're looking for, leadership, capability, training, those sorts of things, and demonstrations of intent that al-Qaeda and or ISIS is going to do external operations against the United States or our interests. If we pick up on those, then it's our obligation to present the President with options to deal with it.
And General Milley, we've seen some reports that in our attempts to try and get over-the-horizon posture in countries around Afghanistan, that we've had discussions with the Russians about some cooperation. Can you help us understand that? For those many of us, that just gives us, like, the hair on our neck starts to go up. Can you explain to us what we're discussing with the Russians and what we are willing to do and not do with the Russians?
Again, I'd prefer to take that into a classified session. As you probably know, about a week or 10 days ago, I discussed over in Europe with the Russians, had a session with 32 Chads and from all the European NATO nations, and then I had a separate session with my counterpart, General Gerasimov. And I can talk to you in a classified session about that, but in the main, we're not asking permission, we're not negotiating, I guess is the word, but President Putin and President Biden had a conversation, and I was following up on that conversation at other direction, direction of my superiors.
I would just say, I think given that it's not permissible right now to share classified information, this committee should be informed should there be any movement towards that with the Russians.
Thank you. General Lady's time has expired, and we've had classified we will have continued classified briefs, as we have said, as many members have said, I think accurately. The counterterrorism strategy in South Asia is going to be a crucial policy issue for all of us to deal with going forward. Ms. Cheney is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, on January 6th, we had a violent attack on our Capitol. It was an effort to stop the constitutionally prescribed process of counting electoral votes. It's the first time in our nation's history that we did not have a peaceful transfer of power. In the aftermath of that attack, many of the members of our constitutional system failed to do their duty. Many of them punted. Many of them today are still attempting to obstruct the investigation into that attack, attempting to whitewash what happened. General Milley, you found yourself in your constitutionally prescribed role standing in the breach. And for any member of this committee, for any American, to question your loyalty to our nation, to question your understanding of our Constitution, your loyalty to our Constitution, your recognition and understanding of the civilian chain of command is despicable. I want to apologize for those members of this committee who've done so, and I want to thank you for standing in the breach when so many, including many in this room, failed to do so. With respect to Afghanistan, the only question for us with respect to the deployment of forces in Afghanistan or anywhere else is what does U.S. security require? In the circumstances we found ourselves in Afghanistan, the deployment of our forces was allowing us to conduct counterterrorism operations, counterintelligence operations, enabling us to prevent terrorists from establishing safe havens. General Milley, terrorists now have an entire country of Afghanistan. Could you tell the committee whether or not you think the current situation in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of forces, which began with the Doha Agreement and the orders that you have described in the Trump administration, which was carried out in the Biden administration, can you tell the committee whether or not you think we are now more safe or less safe, whether Afghanistan presents more of a threat or less of a threat to our homeland than when we were able to conduct counterterrorism, counterintelligence operations there?
I think right now, right this minute, we are more safe because of the efforts over the last 20 years. However, I do think that conditions are more likely than not to develop over the course of time that will allow for the reconstitution of al-Qaeda and or ISIS. And that time varies depending on which analyst you're listening to, but sometime between, say, 6 to 12 and maybe 36 months.
And when you look at the situation that we face today in terms of what's going to be necessary, the loss of life, the loss of treasure has been tragic, has been devastating. But when you look at where we are likely to find ourselves, do you think that our ability to defend ourselves will now be more expensive, will cost us more in terms of lives and treasure going forward, or do you believe that the withdrawal will present a situation where we have to devote less resources to the war on terror?
I think the ends are going to remain the same to protect the American people, but the ways and means are going to change. And I think it's going to become much more difficult now in order to conduct counterterrorism operations against a reconstituted al-Qaeda or ISIS in Afghanistan. Not impossible. We have the capabilities and means to do that, but it will be more difficult.
Secretary Austin, are members of the Haqqani network still a potential target for the United States military?
We do recognize that members of the Haqqani network are recognized terrorists, yes.
So they are a potential target for the United States military?
Potentially, yes.
Secretary Austin, the Biden administration has been saying that the Doha Agreement is still in effect and that they will hold the Taliban to their, quote, counterterrorism commitments in the Doha Agreement. But the Taliban is using this agreement to protect terrorists. The Taliban is intertwined with the Haqqani network, and al-Qaeda has, in fact, sworn buyout to the Taliban. So can you explain exactly how that agreement that's enabling terrorists is going to be useful as some kind of a tool to hold the Taliban to any kind of a commitment?
I think we should do everything within our power to keep pressure on the Taliban to do what they said that they were going to do, and we heard what they said. We will watch their actions, but I think we should continue to apply pressure wherever possible to cause them to keep al-Qaeda activity in check. And again, you've heard us say a couple of times today that we recognize that this is the Taliban. And trust is not an issue here necessarily. We hear what they're saying. We're watching what they do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time has expired.
Ms. Sherrill is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Austin, General Milley, General McKenzie. I have quite a few questions, and some I may have to submit for the record, because I think it's important to start with this and somewhat echo my Republican colleagues' opening. We've continued to see attacks on our democracy and our values from members representing what, at least historically, would have been the extreme elements of the Republican Party. Attacks including, but not limited to, the horrible attack on our Capitol and our Congress on January 6th. And one of the cornerstones of our democracy and our government is civilian, not military, rule. This is sacrosanct to those of us who've worn the uniform. And, judging from the attacks by some members of this committee, poorly understood by those who have not. I have concerns about how the NEO was executed, but I must applaud all of you for scrupulously ensuring our civilian government remained the decision-making authority as you continued to provide your best military advice, even when, at times, your advice differed from the decisions made. Thank you. I'd like to now turn to some questions that I have related to the timeline of events. So, as I understand it, in February of 2020, President Trump made an agreement with the Taliban to withdraw U.S. troops by May 1st, 2021, in exchange for several conditions, including a halt to attacks against U.S. forces and cutting ties with al-Qaeda. By the time he left office, President Trump had drawn down forces to 2,500 and publicly indicated his intent to complete the withdrawal if he had been reelected. And I think, Chairman Milley, you mentioned the 10 November 2020 withdrawal of troops by 15 January 2020, which was rescinded, and then the 17 November 2020 drawdown to 2,500 by 19 January. Is that correct?
It was a memo dated 11 November, 2 days after Secretary Esper was fired. And then on the 17th, it was rescinded. The first memo said go to 0. The second one said go to 2,500.
Thank you. And so were you consulted on the decisions to open negotiations solely with the Taliban to the exclusion of the Afghan government, General?
Very, very late in the game, like days before the signing.
And General Milley, were there concrete plans for withdrawal from the previous administration that were shared and developed with military leadership?
Well, we were 12,600 on the day that the Doha Agreement was 12,600 U.S. military in Afghanistan when the Doha Agreement was signed. Part of that agreement was to go to 8,500 within, I think it was 135 days. I'd have to go back to the agreement and look at it. And then it was to bring down all the U.S. military, NATO, contractors, close all the bases by 1 May. So it was an agreement signed by our government. We dutifully executed a deliberate drawdown over time from February of 20 all the way through based on a set of milestones. So we did withdraw, and we had a plan to withdraw.
Did any of those plans include plans to evacuate civilian American personnel, citizens, and SIV holders?
Yes, General McKenzie and CENTCOM did develop NEO plans, but not like the large SIV holders and lots of American citizens. It was primarily the embassy and their personnel. But I'd defer to Frank McKenzie to talk about the details of the NEO plans at that time.
General McKenzie.
So we hold a NEO plan for every country in the Central Command region. So yes, we had a plan to bring out mainly American citizens and people associated with the embassy. Planning later began to encompass the larger population, the at-risk Afghan population, the SIV population. But initially, like every other plan, it's centered on American citizens and their families.
And when you say the planning later grew to include that, what is the time frame for when you began to include SIV?
No later than the early spring of this year.
So under this administration?
Yes, yes.
And General Milley, in your testimony to the SASC yesterday, you testified that the Trump administration's plans had not been developed via a robust interagency process. How closely were you and other senior military leaders consulted on President Trump's plans as they were developed?
I wasn't consulted on the 11 November order that I received. That's why I went over to the White House with Acting Secretary Miller and the White House Chief of Staff Kash Patel to discuss that order. So I wasn't consulted on it.
Thank you, and my time's expired. I'll submit the rest of my questions for the record.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And here's where I think we're really talking past each other. This war is not done. It's not over. This is a war against Islamic extremism. It's a war against an ideology. And just as it took decades, not 20 years, not 30 years, many more, to defeat the idea of communism, to defeat the idea of fascism, it's going to take decades to defeat the idea of Islamic extremism. General McKenzie, you testified yesterday, al-Qaeda is still at war with us. Do you stand by that statement?
Absolutely, Representative.
DNI Haynes, Biden's Director of National Intelligence, briefed the Congress that al-Qaeda fully intends to attack the West again if given the chance. The head of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's former deputy, has pledged allegiance to the head of the Taliban. Except now they have an entire state to work with, an army, an air force, a functioning international airport, and I think if things continue on the path they are, possibly billions in international currency reserves. So, Mr. Chairman, respectfully, we're not done with this war. I would have thought we would have learned the lesson from Iraq. I would have thought, Mr. Secretary, you would learn the lesson from Iraq, where we pulled out in 2011. Mr. Chairman, you issued a statement praising that pullout as ending that war, and yet we found ourselves 3 years later with soldiers going back in. So, but let's look at the situation, because I think the American people need to understand this. Here we have Iraq. We pulled out, led to the rise of the ISIS caliphate, which was obviously a morphed entity from al-Qaeda. Look at all of the bases that we had to deal with when we went back. We had bases in the Gulf. We had bases in Kuwait. We had bases in Turkey, in Jordan, of course in Israel, allied bases in Cyprus. We had allies on the ground in the Kurds. We didn't let ISIS take over the government in Baghdad and the army and all of the functions of the state. We had all of these assets to work with to go clean up that mess. And how many soldiers and lives did we lose from cleaning up that mistaken withdrawal, Mr. Chairman? But let's transition over here to Afghanistan. What do we see? Do we have, General McKenzie, do we have a single base in Afghanistan now?
We have no base in
Do we have a base in any country neighboring Afghanistan?
We do not.
Do we have any local allies approaching the capability of the Kurds?
We do not. There may be some options, but we do not.
We have the Northern Alliance. The Panjshir has been taken. Frankly, they're being slaughtered right now as we speak with our weapons, with our damn equipment. Our allies are being slaughtered. Every morning we wake up to beheading videos, to executions, to people being hunted down with our own database. But when and if you have to present options to the president, how many soldiers are we going to lose? Because we have no allies on the ground, we have no bases in the region. Now we're going to get to really the crux of the issue, which is over-the-horizon counterterrorism. Those drones have to fly all the way around Iran and all the way up Pakistan and lose 70 to 80% of their fuel before they even get anywhere near a target. And we just saw from the failed attack, the botched attack, that you have to have multi-intelligence confirming what that drone operator is seeing. I've called it in, and I know that drone operator would have appreciated somebody on the ground saying, no, that's a civilian, don't pull that trigger. So I appreciate your candor in saying how difficult this is going to be, but the President of the United States is selling this country a fiction that we can do over here with nothing, what we're doing over here with neighboring base access, with allies on the ground, and with ocean access. That is a fiction that I think you all need to own, and we need to be honest with the American people. I am just livid at the fact of the future Americans that are going to have to go back to clean up this mess. We are watching this horror movie that Representative Slotkin experienced, that we all experienced after Iraq. The president continues to say, well, we can do what we do in Somalia. We can do what we do in Syria. Mr. Secretary, you just briefed about a strike in Syria. We have a lot more capability there. One more question. Do we have any evidence, intelligence or otherwise, of Pakistani troops on the ground, intelligence officers, air support, or any troops on the ground assisting the Taliban, or command and control assisting the Taliban offensive?
I'd prefer to answer that question in closed session.
I'll take that as a yes. And Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Wells, your time has expired.
that's not going to go to a civil war. It's going to go to a regional war.
And just for the record, we're not going to put words in the mouths of our witnesses. You can't take it as a yes if it was not, in fact, a yes.